All right, I'm going to ask for a little bit of participation really quick, and I know like all of you guys, there's so many of you people who are just like, I don't raise my hand, okay? But please, give me I won't do it more than just, there's only 3. Is that like fair? Where you're like, okay, it's just 3. Fair? Okay, here, real quick, okay? Show of hands, how many of you would like to be rich? Okay, I think some of you are lying. Put your hands down. I think some of you guys are like, this is church, you're not supposed to do that. Let me rephrase the question really quick. How many of you, if I had a check for you today for $20 million, you would turn it down today? You would turn it down. No, thank you? Talk to me after service. These people are incorruptible. My hand would not be up. I'd be like, you 20 minutes? Yes, I have a lot of plans for 20 minutes. Whenever people say, money can't buy happiness, don't you always kind of think like, I don't know if you know how to spend it then? Like, do you have that? That's what runs through my head because I'm like, I don't know, man. There's a lot of happiness that I can purchase when I have money. I get that there's bigger principles, but we were just talking about being happy. I think that most people in this world, right, would be glad to have more than they have, right? Most people in this world have probably looked at people who've had what you would consider a lot, and you thought like, man, what would it be like, right? Like, what would it be like to have that? Actually, just the other day, my son's like, what would you do? Because we were anyone watching Beast games? Right? Yeah. So he's like, what would you do like if we had like $5 million? And I was like thinking like, what would I do if I had like $5 million, right? And it's like that dream that you have. Some of you guys, you even had this like when the Mega Millions gets to like 100 million, you guys had conversations at work about like, what would you do if you had the $100 million, right? And then you didn't even go and buy a lotto ticket, but you spent significant time thinking about what you would do if you had it, right? No, I think most of us, we've kind of wondered at that idea. But here's a second question, and this one I'm guessing will get a bigger response. How many of you would like to go to heaven? Yeah, okay, good. I'm guessing that's why most of you are here. We're like, yeah, it's part of the strategy, actually. Here's why I say these two things. Most of us would believe that the first question I asked and that last question that I asked have no connection. Would you like to be rich? Would you like to go to heaven? I think most of us would actually expect those are two completely different scenarios. Those are two completely different conversations, right? I mean, money's something that we have to deal with here and now. It's kind of like a necessary evil we work with while we're here on earth. But obviously, when we're talking about my faith, that's kind of a different subject. Most of us would not really think there's a strong correlation between the two. But Jesus startled his followers one time when he was traveling around. This guy came up to him, and he started to ask him a question. And this interaction is fascinating, okay? I need you to lean in for a second while I read you this verse. It's a little bit long, but the story is fascinating. Here's what it says in Luke 18 through 27. Once a religious leader asked Jesus this question, "Good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" That's our question, right? I want to go to heaven. He goes, what do I need to do to have eternal life, to get to heaven, right? Jesus says, well, why do you call me good? Jesus asked him. Only God is truly good. But to answer your question, you know the commandments. You must not commit adultery. You must not murder. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely. Honor your father and mother. Jesus gives him like the 10 commandments, basically, right? And the man replied, well, I've obeyed all these commandments since I was young. The man has paused for a second because he's like, I've done all that, but I'm still convinced that's not enough to get me to heaven. I'm still convinced that me just doing those things isn't enough to actually right the wrongs that I've had in my life. I'm still not convinced that that would actually satisfy my relationship with God. And this is amazing because he's standing literally in front of Jesus asking this question. This guy might be one of the smartest men we see in the Bible. He's asking the right question to the right man, right? Like he's standing in front of Jesus going, but there's more than that, right? And Jesus is like, that's literally the whole reason why Jesus is here. He says, I've obeyed all these commandments since I was young. And when Jesus heard his answer, he said this, there's still one thing you haven't done. Sell all your possessions, give the money to the poor, and then you'll have treasure in heaven, and then come follow me. He goes, go back, sell all your stuff, come and follow me, become one of my disciples, walk with me, and see what I do. That's where your answer will be found. It says in verse 23, but when the man heard this, he became very sad, for he was very rich. When Jesus saw this, he turns from the man to the crowd, and he says this statement. And everyone at the moment was startled. And even to this day, if you haven't read this before, this should startle you. He says this: "How hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. In fact, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." Then those who heard this said, "Then who can be saved?" And he replied, "What's impossible for people is possible with God." Jesus makes this startling statement. He has this interaction with this man. He says, "Go and sell everything you have." The man walks away sad because it said he was very rich. He looks from him and he says, "Let me tell you what just happened here, crowd. It's easier for a camel to go through a needle than for a rich person to make it to heaven." Now, people have tried to misinterpret this for years. They've been like, oh, at this time, there was this thing called like the needle gate, and it was like this little gate, and you could take a camel and you could unpack him, and he would shimmy down, and he would go through, and you're like, wait a second, actually, that didn't even exist at the time. That's not really true. People say, well, actually, camel kind of sounds a little bit like the word thread, and maybe what he meant is like it's as hard as like threading like a piece of thread through like a needle, right? But you're like, well, people do that every day. Seamstresses, you're like, people do that every day. That doesn't really seem that dramatic. We don't need some sort of new interpretation to this because, listen to me, it's exactly what you think he's saying. There isn't some like weird like smoke and mirrors. In fact, really quick, if you ever listen to Bible teachers that every time it's like some weird like smoke and mirrors, like, but what you don't understand, don't listen to that person, okay? Let me tell you this. I'm going to tell you something today that 10,000 other pastors have said before. It's nothing new. I'm just going to reinterpret it so you understand it. Do you get that? Like there is no like turn or smoke and mirrors. It's exactly what you think it is. And we know it is because he interprets it for himself. We don't need some sort of different interpretation. He goes, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to go to heaven. They go, who can be saved? And Jesus explains what the parable means. He says, for man, it's impossible. He interprets the parable for us. What he was saying was, let me explain the biggest animal that you know of and the smallest thing you can imagine so that you can grasp the impossibility. We know this is the case because actually they say this saying existed in Persia, but in Persia it was to fit an elephant through the eye of a needle because in Persia they had elephants. Now, my guess is most of you haven't spent much time with camels, right? Anyone camel, like a camel farmer? I would be so amped, be like, yes, yeah. I wanted to show it to you. Guys, could you bring out, I decided you need to picture this because these people grew up around camels nonstop, okay? This was their basic means of transportation at the time. And Jesus goes, let me explain to you, right? It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to be saved. And most of you don't spend much time with camels. So I wanted to show you really quick so that there's no confusion. This is exactly what he was talking about. This is a full-grown dromedary camel that's from the region at the time, right? And he goes, this is what I need you to picture. When you're considering being rich and getting to heaven, it's this going through that. Do you get the parable? Like, it's not confusing, right? He goes like, camel? They're like, yeah, camel. He's like, needle. And they're like, he's like, exactly, right? Like, there isn't some way, real quick, there isn't some way that you can finagle this one, right? You're like, well, surely there's like, he's like, no. You get it, right? There's no like secret strategy here. There's no, I actually found a guy online when researching this. He said, what if we liquefy the camel? And I'm like, you're going to hell for sure. Like, you're definitely the guy he's talking about and you're going to hell. And you're like, wait, what if we liquefy it? And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, absolutely. But no, I wanted you to see that. This is what he's saying, right? Camel, needle, impossible, right? Make sense? Thank you, guys. You can go ahead and set Mr. Camel aside for now. We'll bring him back in future weeks. Now, The parable stands. Camel, needle, impossible. But here's where it becomes interesting, okay? For many of us, when we hear that story, you read that story, you're like, got it, okay, awesome. But real quick, you probably had the same thought that I had. Well, that sucks for those rich people. I mean, right? Didn't you kind of have the same thought that I had where like you read it and you're like, well, too bad for those rich people. Glad I don't have to worry about that. Right? I mean, I'm not rich. I'm not rich. I'm not the one he's talking about, right? We have to put a parable into perspective. Really quick, this same parable is being taught all around the globe this morning. Like other pastors on the other side of the globe are teaching this exact same verse on the other side of the planet. And he's going, there are rich people. And rich people, it's going to be impossible for them to get to heaven unless God does some sort of miracle. This is a real issue. And really quick, thinking about the idea that the same parable is being taught all around the world, and this morning people are considering who would a rich person be, just for reference. If you live in the United States of America and last year you made $50,000, you are the top 2% of wage earners for the entire world. If you made $50,000 last year, 98% of people in the world made less than you last year. In other words, if you made $50,000 last year, a whole bunch of people would be going rich. Another way we could do this is to also remember this same parable has been taught for literally 2,000 years. 2,000 years of this parable being taught. Really quick, did you know that at the turn of the last century, in 1900, do you know what the average American lived on in today's dollars? $5 a day. You're like, that's not possible. You are so far away from it that you don't remember what people used to live like. People used to live multi-generationally in homes. They had one pair of clothes that were nice. Not too far away behind us, just my great-grandmother tells stories of the fact that mom had to basically make their stuff. There was no money for anything. They raised their own food in their farm. And this same parable has been taught for 2,000 years. And really quick for me, over those 2,000 years, let me explain to you what the majority, okay? If we just took humanity across the last 2,000 years since this parable was first taught until today, let me just tell you what the broad majority of the definition people would say a rich person is. There are people that are so rich that they don't fear for their next meal. They're not concerned about their next meal. They have enough food. There are people that are so rich that they have shelter all year round and they don't worry about the cold or the summer sun when it comes. There are people that are so rich that their children are all provided for. Their children have medical care and their children have all of these other things. They get to get educated. There are people that are so rich that they pay for all of the necessities of their life, and then they still have more left over. That's what history has called rich forever. There are people who can pay for everything they need, and then they still have so much money that they can decide to go on a trip somewhere for fun. Not afraid that if they don't work for a week, their family would starve. There are people so rich that at the end of the week, they take and they throw away extra food and pay someone to haul away extra food they don't eat. There are people that are so rich that they take literally bags and bags of clothes they don't even want or need anymore and just go, get it out of here. Throughout history, people would go, could you imagine being that rich? I think actually the best test wouldn't be the test of the world or the test of the generations. I think this should actually be our test. Here's what I was thinking. Jesus talks to this man, And he says, you want to experience something supernatural and spiritual. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go home and I want you to sell everything you have. And it says, the man went away very sad, for he had very much. And he goes, see, that man's rich. Here's perhaps the better test we should do. If today Jesus told you, I want you to go home and I want you to sell everything you have. And then I want you to focus on coming and following me. Would you have the same response as the rich man? Would you feel sad? Because listen, if your response is the same as the rich man, it means you're in the same spot. It means you're the same person. If your response is the same as the man Jesus just talked about, I would be really sad. Let me be really real with you. I'm not pointing at you. I'm saying me. If God said, Cameron, go home, sell everything you have, the first thought, I'd honestly be like, oh. Right? I'd be like, oh man. Right? I actually think that this parable might be the most critical parable for the church in the United States of America to get. Here's why. I think we live in the most dangerous environment for this teaching. Because almost all of us in the American church are rich, and almost none of us feel rich. We live in such an opulent culture. We live with such a massive divide of ultra wealth around us that I believe the majority of us are rich, like Jesus taught about. And he goes, let me warn you, this is a real danger to your faith. And almost none of us are scared by that at all because we don't think we're rich. We might live in the most dangerous culture ever for this scenario because we don't even take a parable like this seriously because we don't feel rich. I get you. I don't feel rich. Not one bit. But the reality is, what if, right, if our response was the same as that rich man, what if the reality is, by Jesus' metric where he was offering this warning, we're the people who need to hear this. We're the people who need to hear this warning and then consider it deeply. Because all you guys just said, I want to go to heaven. And Jesus goes, well, let me offer you a really stark warning for you who want to get to heaven. There is a danger in riches that makes it almost impossible for someone to get to heaven unless God does the impossible. Now, I want to do this, okay? I want to take this week and the next 3 weeks to break down a few principles because here's what I believe Jesus is saying. I don't think the answer is for all of you to go home and sell all your possessions today. I don't think the answer is for all of us to become poor. There are people who make bad interpretations of this, and they're like, see, so like rich people bad, poor people good. And you're like, well, that's just Marxism, right? And it doesn't work anyway. But the situation that we're talking about here is that he says impossible, and then he says unless God, right? The answer is not necessarily the situation of the money. That's not our solution. The solution is involving God's wisdom into it. Because he said what is impossible to man is possible with God. Listen to me. Someday in the future, okay, you will go and you will stand in front of the Lord after your death. And this is my fear. I'm afraid that some of you are going to have a camel standing there with you. I'm afraid that you're going to get there and you're going to see that needle of a gate into heaven, and you're going to be trying to take your camel with you. You're like, I can have this though too, right? And Jesus is going to go, don't you remember my parable? Here's what I believe. I think that if you get the wisdom that God has, I believe that God could make you exceedingly rich. This is actually the crazy part. I don't think the answer is like, y'all need to become poor. I actually believe wholeheartedly God would love to make a whole bunch of you exceedingly more rich than you are. I think he would be glad to do it. Glad to. But you know what's amazing is God is so good and so loving, he's not going to do it if it's going to keep you out of heaven. If he knows that's what's going to keep you out of heaven, he's not going to do it because he loves you too much. I mean, listen, I would love for all you guys to be like, just like blessed. Like if I could just be like praying prayers like, dude, $1 million, boom, like $1 million, boom, right? Awesome. But way more than I want you guys to be rich, I want you to make it to heaven. I would rather you be poor the rest of your life. I would rather you struggle. But if your spirit was right with God, that's what would matter even more. Listen, someday the camel will meet the needle, and without God, there is no hope at all. So this is what we need. We need God's wisdom in it. So here's what I'm going to do. If you would like, first of all, you realize, oh, maybe I actually am rich because I had the same response as that. I don't know, I don't feel rich, but maybe I should actually do this. And you caught that warning. I invite you to listen today and the next 3 weeks, or just real quick, and you could say this is bad. I'm not going to say it's bad. You work on it in the next 3 weeks. If you're like, I want to be rich. I want to actually be able to earn more, make more, do more. Okay, then listen to me. I need you to lean in, because if you actually believe that you want to see more blessings in your life, this is going to be critical if it's not going to destroy your spirit. I'm going to talk this week and the next 3 weeks about key principles that God speaks, and this is what I truly do believe. If you grasp these, if you apply these to your life, Jesus will shrink that camel, stretch that needle, and of course, it's going to work. Jesus could bless your life, and it wouldn't keep you out of heaven, but only if God is involved in it. Would you like to know them? Yeah? Does anyone like me, after hearing that, go like, I desperately need this because I'm kind of afraid? Yeah, that's what I felt when I read this verse, to be honest with you. All right, here's what I want to do. I want to talk to you about these 4 things this week. That's kind of my introduction to set. But I want to talk to you about the core principle that we start with, and then each of these next 3 build on top of them. The 4 principles are going to just be one-word principles, and then I will explain them. And the first one is of critical importance. It is the word stewardship. Stewardship. Now, this is an old school word, not one that you hear commonly in our culture today. A steward was somebody that a king would give finances to spend for him. A steward was somebody the king would give money to, and he would say, you invest it, you do stuff with it, start a business, right? Invest it into different ventures, and then you come back and you bring returns. And if a steward did a good job, the king would give him extra money, the king would bless him, the king would give him all these different other things in response to his faithfulness with the money that the king had. And the big principle that we need to grasp for us with money is a stewardship mindset. You see, there is bad thinking when it comes to this money. Some of you guys even thought it as I just started down this route. You thought, I don't understand why God's concerned about my money. I don't get why Cameron's interested in my money. I don't get why the church needs my money. I don't know why God's concerned about my money. And see, that's exactly backwards. It isn't your money. I heard this joke a long time ago. I thought it was great. This preacher said, you know, if God wanted your money, he would just take it and there would be a greasy spot where you used to stand. If God was after your money, right, it would be that easy. The reality is this, a stewardship mindset realized this key principle. Listen to me. Here's the main point. When it comes to money, it's all God's. It's all God's. Psalm 24, 1-2 says, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all its people belong to him, for he laid the earth's foundation on the seas and he built it on the ocean depths. God is the creator and therefore the owner of everything on this earth. It all belongs to him. And you would say, but I built a career, but I built a business, but I built these things, right? But I would say, yes, but you didn't build it without him. You used what he gave to you, and then you created something. That's the definition of a steward. But a steward has to realize it's not his money. Listen, if you built a career, that's amazing, but none of you ignited your own consciousness in your own mind. that wisdom and that ideas that you had, right? You worked really hard and that's great, but you didn't create this body. You didn't pay for this air you're breathing, right? Like all of this is just here and you used it to build something. That's what a steward does. I love in physics, there's this term called the law of conservation of energy. Does anyone remember that one? Law of conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only transfer into different forms. It can only transfer. You can't create energy. You can't destroy energy, right? When you set something on fire, it doesn't destroy it. The energy that's stored in that turns into heat energy, turns into vapor energy, all these different things. It's just transferring energy to something else. They actually say the system of energy in the universe is a closed circle. God created all of it and there's no more being created. All we can do is transfer it. And that's the reality is he owns everything. We just use what he has to build something. If you need evidence of this fact that it is truly all God's and it isn't yours, it's really quite simple. The richest man on earth thousands of years ago, named King Solomon, who was richer than Jeff Bezos multiplied by Elon Musk, right? He said this in Ecclesiastes 5:15, we all come to the end of our lives as naked and as empty-handed as on the day we were born. We can't take our riches with us. This guy had more money than you could even fathom. And he goes, you know what's fascinating about all this wealth is that you can't actually hold on to it. Listen, if you need clear evidence of the fact that what you have is not yours, realize the idea that you can't even hold on to it. Someday soon, you will leave this earth. I just did a funeral just this Friday. The guy was only like 54 years old. Someday soon, you will leave this earth, and listen to me, after your funeral, you know what's going to happen? Your family is going to go back to your house, to your property, to your stuff, and they are going to sell off, throw away, give away, lose, or ignore everything you have. In fact, you know the majority of it, literally, I'm sorry, they're going to come and they're just going to pay somebody to bring a big box and they're going to put all of it in the box and be like, get rid of that stuff. That beautiful house, right? Over the course of a handful of different years, it's going to fall apart. And someday soon, someone's going to go bulldoze it. It's a junk. Build something new. That beautiful car you have right now, oh my goodness, someday it's going to be sitting in a boneyard rusting or put into scrap and turned into cans. Every single thing we have in this world, listen, is simply on loan from God currently. It's just loaned to you for a season. It's all his. You don't get to hold on to it. You just get to use it for a period of time while you're here. That's all any of us get. You see, this is why the conversation of our money is so important, because if it was just yours, you'd be like, I don't understand why God's so interested in my money. But if I go, wait a second, it's actually not yours, it's all his, and he's loaning it to you for a period of time, all of a sudden the reason why Jesus would have something to say about how you use that money, it makes sense, right? If I lent you like $1,000 to start a business, wouldn't I have the right to come back and be like, how's it going? You'd be like, why are you all up in my business? Be like, well, it's my money. That's why I can ask something about it, because it's my money. And all of a sudden, maybe we've had this American mindset, our individuals, like, why would God have anything to say about money? You're like, well, wait a second, what if it's all his? And he goes, hey, use this for me for a while. And then Jesus wants to say something. You're like, actually, it kind of makes sense that he would have something to say about his money that I'm using. Listen to what's said in Luke 16, 10 through 13, okay? It says this, if you are faithful in little things, you will be faithful in large ones. But if you're dishonest in little things, you won't be honest with greater responsibilities. And if you're untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who will trust you with the true riches of heaven? If you're not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with things of your own? Here, as the master turns, this is Jesus teaching, he says this, no one can serve two masters. You'll hate one and you'll love the other. You'll be devoted to one and you'll despise the other. And then perhaps the sentence that no one expected him to cap this off with: you cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. Jesus is pointing to this picture that money is not just something that we have to deal with here on earth. It's like a worldly necessity we have to deal with. He says this: money all belongs to God. The riches of this world belong to God. He lends it to you, and the reason why he lends it to you is to see if you are trustworthy or not. He says money is like this thing that God uses. He puts riches, he puts stuff in your life, and the reason why he does it is a means of going, are you trustworthy? Are you trustworthy? Are you righteous? Are you faithful? Or are you unfaithful? He actually says, I have way greater things to give your life than money. Oh, I have like secret riches of heaven. But he goes, well, how on earth could I know if I can trust you with that if I can't even trust you with money? This is the little stuff. He goes, this is like the little stuff I give you, and I go, so would you trust what I say is wise in regards to this? Because if I know I can trust you here, man, then I could really do something in your life. I believe that God has greater things for you, and money is one of the ways by which God says, can I trust you to actually follow through with what I say? This also brings into clarity so much more the whole parable of the camel and the needle, doesn't it? Where you're like, but why is it impossible? But why is it impossible that if you're rich, it can't fit? Why does that mean a camel has to go through here just because you're rich? And here Jesus clarifies it even more, right? He says, because the number one competitor for your heart as a Jesus follower isn't the devil, it's money. That's surprising, isn't it? He's like, it's not like you're going to choose whether or not you're going to worship Jesus or you're going to worship the devil. He says, that's not the big fear. He says, let me tell you what is scary. You're either going to probably worship me or you're going to worship your money. Your whole life is going to become worshipful of money. You see, instead of money as a means to show God our trustworthiness and the fact that he has first place in our life, we can get to the place where, listen, all we do is pray to God in hopes for more money. We're not considering how our finances can show God how faithful we are. All we're doing is praying, God bless me, God bless me, God bless me, God bless me. Do you get that? You're asking Jesus to serve your true God. Jesus, could you do this for this other God, this idol that I love more than you? Because that's actually got the first place in my life. Listen, for the man who puts his trust in God and money, he will soon determine that he cannot trust God. Let me say that one more time. For the man who puts his trust in God and money, he will soon determine that he cannot trust God. That's the danger. He goes, when you try to hold on to both of these things, this will become an idol. And he says, you'll begin to despise God because you love money so much. You see, if our money is actually God's, it makes sense that this is a spiritual issue of infinite importance. That he goes, this is what's going to try to steal your heart away from truly loving me. Listen, there are people who, because of this, money becomes the purpose of their life, not the Lord. There are people, because of this temptation, money will become the passion of their life, not the Lord. There are people, because of this, money will fill the dreams of their life, not the Lord. And money will become the God that they serve, the God that they trust in, the God that they worship. And he goes, right. And then your chances of heaven, a camel fitting through a needle. Unless we actually make Jesus the Lord of our life. unless we actually invite him into all of our life, and especially including this money that could be so pernicious. I would love for all of you to be rich, but even more, I want you all to make it to heaven. And I think God will be happy to make so many of you much more rich than you are, but he won't do it if it's going to keep you out of heaven. Jesus said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to enter into heaven, which means it's impossible unless, of course, God did something to your heart. So here's my prayer that this week and the next 3 weeks, God would do something to your heart. The first thing we could get, the first thing we could grasp, a stewardship mindset. When it comes to money, it's all God's. For some of you today, I hope that you have a little bit of a perspective shift. You don't feel rich, and you don't feel any richer just because I told you that. That's not how it happens, right? You're like, I just walk out of here feeling rich, right? But you might realize the danger of your riches and go, actually, I think I am the rich young ruler in that story. You need to realize that your money is not yours. It's on loan from God. It's all God's. In fact, this is what I would love for you to do. This is a really simple application if you think I need to grow in this. I would love to invite you this week that as you go to use your car, as you go to your property, to your house, as you put on your clothes, as you pull out your bank statements, that you would look at all of those things and you would remind yourself this week, it's all God's. It's all God's. It's not mine. I'll soon be gone and this will all be left behind. It's all just on loan. For some more of you, I would love to even invite you to do this. Some of you guys, you're more conscious. You're like the person who you keep track of stuff. And I would literally invite you this week to sit down and pull up your bank account, your savings account, your retirement account, your investment account, and to pause for a second and look at those and remind yourself, it's all God's. It's not mine. It's just on loan for a season while I'm here, but it's all his. And if you start grasping this concept, then the next 3 things we're going to talk about is going to be so much easier, where you go, of course, it makes sense that God would have something to say about his money. That's my prayer for you. One more prayer, though, today. If there are any of you that when I said that about how many of you want to go to heaven, you're like, that's me. But you have that same feeling that rich young ruler had, because maybe so far all you've ever heard about is religion, and you're like, well, keep the law, do this. And I love this man because actually he was so smart. He goes, but there's got to be something more than that. My heart still feels so lost. My spirit still feels so dark. My mind still feels so clouded. It surely can't just be keeping some rules. This man was asking exactly the right question to exactly the right person. And Jesus explained what we should do. Now, Jesus isn't alive here today for you to follow, but the principle stands. He says, here's what you can do. You can let go of the death grip you have on this life, and you can come and follow me. And he says, and then you will have eternal life. Friends, that's exactly what we call salvation is. That Jesus came to this earth, he lived a perfect life, and then he died on the cross. And it says that when he died, because he had no sin, he carried your sin and my sin, and he paid for it on the cross. And then what we do in response is we let go of our death grip of this world, thinking we can fix it, and we put our trust in Jesus. And we say, this sin, this separation I have from God, the struggles that I have, instead of me trying to fix it all, Jesus, would you forgive me? Would you direct my life? Would you lead my life? And that's what we call salvation. And then you just begin to follow after Jesus. And I guarantee you, listen, he will forgive your sin. He will keep forgiving your sin. He will keep healing your shame. He will keep taking away the sadness and the sickness and the depression, and he'll walk with you through it, through the rest of this life. And then someday, when that day comes where you close your eyes and you go on to eternity, he's going to be waiting there with open arms. Say, welcome home. Would you pray with me for a second? Jesus, first I just pray for anyone who's here that this warning of the camel maybe caught their attention. I pray that you would bring change in their heart. Lord, not a feeling of fear, but a feeling of, I need to get this one. I pray that you would bring courage in their heart to maybe even just look at these things and declare over them that they belong to you. I pray you would give them a perspective shift at a deep level so that they could grasp this. God, it is my prayer that not one of them would miss heaven for something as silly as money and trying to take that camel with them.